Okay, I hope the audio on this is all right. Um, this video is going to be a slightly different focus from my usual videos, insofar as it's not a video about any particular news topic. It's not a political video, it's not about something happening in the news, which tends to be the main sort of themes I cover. Um, this is a video about positive energy. I'm partly doing this for myself, but also there was one of my subscribers, Chulz Ampala, I think you mentioned um, this issue about uh, sometimes feeling depressed and so on, and I imagine a lot of people watching this can relate to the subject. Um, how do we reach positive energy if you're going through a lot of negative energy? Now, I just explain my own context here. I'm not particularly miserable right now. I'm not particularly happy either. There's some things in my own private life which I don't want to share online that are, let's just say, not ideal. Very far from ideal. So I am someone who has been through clinical depression in the past. The subject of mental health is a very, very important one, and it's one that has been featured somewhat in this general election. To their credit, the Liberal Democrats are giving it a lot of priority. And I do say to their credit because it's something that sometimes, I think as Nick Clegg puts it, it's something that's so overshadowed by sort of physical ailments, which are a lot more obvious. Anyway, this video isn't about the wider subject of mental health, but obviously that comes into it. Rather, it's about positive energy in relation to how we divulge information. Now, I'm someone that, frankly, I'd have to be honest, I'm a serious-minded person. Um, but sometimes maybe I would give the impression with my videos that I'm very negative or cynical. Actually, I'm very optimistic and I try to be positive about a lot of things, but sometimes perhaps that negative energy shows through more. And I just want to discuss this sort of thing. One thing I always say is I always try to be grateful for what I have, and without wanting to sound like I'm preaching, I do think everyone should try and do that. Try and really, really look at their own circumstances and always consider that no matter how hard things are, someone out there, either in your own country or somewhere in the world, has it much worse. I mean, as I'm making this, I'm thinking of those poor souls in Nepal right now who have lost everything. They've lost loved ones, they've lost their homes. Um, and you know, when you see a disaster like that, you'd have to be a pretty cold bastard or a cold bitch not to have some sort of human empathy for that. But what my response is to a disaster is, on one hand, to feel sympathetic to fellow human beings who are going through a terrible ordeal, but also as a reflection that my own life, as challenging as it sometimes is, I don't have to face some of the problems that some people do. I find there's a curious thing about sometimes negative energy. Sometimes it is based on empathy. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but think of it this way. Most people, when they get angry about something, especially in political issues, it is actually not a selfish anger in most circumstances. Most, not all, but most circumstances, it's an anger about what they think is going wrong for society or for something they believe that is unjust in society. Therefore, the anger is actually empathetic because they're thinking of fellow people who are suffering as a result of this bad policy or this. I'm not going to make this an excessively political video, but I'm just bringing that into it because it is relevant. Um, it's relevant because I think for serious-minded people, I mean, Charlotte, you mentioned that you try to avoid watching the news. I completely understand that because it could definitely get you down. I mean, these days I'm quite my emotional response to this election is different than it was in 2010. In 2010, my emotions were a lot more raw. Actually, my personal circumstances have barely changed since that time. I mean, a lot has happened for me in 5 years, but in many ways, my actual personal circumstances are pretty much the same. Yet in 2010, my emotions were a lot more raw, and I remember having a very short temper at that time. So in my own sense, I think I've come far in that regard. I don't have such a quick temper, and I'm more. In fact, I can honestly say in this election cycle, and this is a strange thing for me, I haven't found myself getting extremely angry with any particular politician. Whereas in the last election cycle, there were particular policies coming out with particular parties. The exact details aren't really relevant because it's not the point of the video, but I remember at that time my emotions were quite raw. I remember I was watching one Question Time program and I had to walk out halfway through. I was watching one with my parents and I walked out of the room because I just got so angry. And, I find it hard to control my temper. Nowadays, I'm quite, I guess in some ways I'm thicker skinned. Um, this is just speaking for myself because maybe it's because I know that I myself may well be involved in the political process in the not so distant future, and I'm a politically minded person, so it would make sense that I might well put myself up as a candidate one day if the circumstances seem right to me. But I just want to focus here on how we get positive energy when there is so much negativity out there. I think it's a combination of things. Firstly, it's a recognition that if you, for example, take a world situation, and if you're influenced by, let's say, negative media, negative news, like sad stories, tragic stories, crimes, policies you disagree with, etc. It it's very understandable that the world can seem like a very dark place, and it can all seem very gloomy and despairing. But I think it's very, very important to recognize that at any one time, nothing is all good or all bad. And I'll focus more on the latter. Nothing is always all bad. There is always, I mean, on a world scope, if we look at all the problems of the world, let's just group them together for a minute. War, pollution, human rights abuses, poverty, corruption, inequality. Those are sort of the main themes. Religious extremism would be another one. But if you look at all the world's problems, um, in every country, there is some things that are progressing, and in other parts of the world, things are regressing, getting worse. But in some situations, they're actually getting better. So it would be very tempting, for example, if you look at the news, you would think, okay, the earthquake is a natural phenomenon. But let's look at man-made events. Let's look at war, for example. It would be very tempting to look. I mean, I watched Al Jazeera last night, and 5 stories in a row were about conflict. 4 of those were in the Middle East. So it'd be very thinking to think, well, the world is out of control. But if we look at war, for example, and I might make a specific video about this because it's a subject I'm particularly interested in, it would be tempting to think the world is out of control. But actually, the actual fact of the matter is there's technically fewer conflicts in the world today than there was in the 1970s, for example. And the problem with saying that is people are very, very, very easily swayed by what they see. People are swayed by emotional responses, and that is understandable. I am as well. You'd have to be a robot not to be. But whilst on one hand you can think, well, there's all of these terrible conflicts happening in the Middle East right now. People could argue to the blue in the face about the causes and so on. But then you need to look at other situations in the world that have actually got better. I mean, I would argue the conflict in Colombia, for instance, is definitely winding down. It isn't at the sort of intense level it was in the 1980s and 1990s when Colombia became a byword for violence. Now I think it's fair to say that is definitely winding down, although it's far from resolved. The reason I'm mentioning that is because it's to kind of make the case that the worldwide situation is never all good or all bad. There was some very bloody conflicts in Africa throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s that are now largely resolved. Examples would be Angola, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Liberia. They were all very bloody civil wars. They're all now virtually in a state of peace. The challenge they have now is overcoming poverty and the post-war legacy, but to a large extent they're in a state of peace. So I think whenever we look at the world situation, you need to really, really look at the whole context. One thing I've always tried to steer away from is sweeping statements about anything, because I think sweeping statements don't do justice to the whole picture of any given situation. And without wanting to sound too tectonic about this, um, actually that helps. If you are someone who you get depressed over what's happening in the world, what I would say is, yeah, that's a human response, and you wouldn't be human if you didn't have some response to that. But it's important to look at the whole situation. Now, in terms of personal, people's personal lives, obviously, I don't know everyone's story, and it's not like sometimes people want to keep that private, completely understandably. But how to get positive energy when it is so tempting to be cynical and in a bad mood and cranky, and it's not an easy one. A lot of people say humor is the answer, but I'm someone who finds it genuinely quite difficult to find, for example, stand-up comedy particularly funny, or, I'll be candid, I'm a serious-minded person, and it's not that I don't want to be amused, it's that I genuinely don't find very many things that funny. I genuinely just don't find that many stand-up comedians particularly funny. Most of them I find rather childish and tiresome. And the thing is, people sort of judge you if you don't really get into humorous things, then you must be a wet blanket. But I think you can find positive energy in other regards. It doesn't just have to be comedy. It can also be things you find attractive, beautiful. And I'm not just talking about in terms of people. Like, obviously, as a heterosexual man, I'm attracted to women. But I'm not just talking in that sense. I'm talking about anything that you find appealing. What I would say is, a lot of people, myself included, spend a lot of energy on challenging or pointing out or confronting things that they don't like, and that is understandable. And I do that a lot. I'll be honest, I do that a lot, especially on this channel. And I have no regrets doing it because I'm grateful that I have a vacuum in order to do it. But what I would say, and I'm not a professional counselor, but simply as a peer, as a fellow human being, it makes sense to me that if you have negative energy, if you think about injustice, if you think about unfairness, if you think about all these sort of things, of course you're going to end up in a situation where you get depressed. So I think the only way to avoid it is to try and somehow balance that thinking out. Somehow balance it out. So it doesn't mean to repress the negative feelings. I don't think that's healthy. I think it's important that they're out in the open, but I also think it's important to find something that you enjoy. And, I'm simply sharing ideas here. I'm not sort of trying to play the role of a counselor, but simply find something that you enjoy, that you find um, gives you some pleasure or some sense of contentment, even if it's a relatively little thing. And it all builds up. It all builds up to create at least a balanced outcome. Now, I've been in situations where I've been severely depressed. And believe me, I know how hard it is to climb out of that sort of pit. And it isn't simply feeling bad. A lot of people, I think, can have a feeling where they don't feel so good. They're in a bad mood for whatever reason. But clinical depression is something that really does grasp your entire existence. It can really, really have an impact. And, if someone was to take off time work for clinical depression, people would think they're just being lazy. Oh, you're in a bad mood, get over yourself, something like that. But they need to understand just how powerful this is. And I think if there's more of a political talk about this, then it's a good thing. If it's more out in the open, if it's more, that's a good thing. That is a good thing because it means that ultimately we'll become a more humane society, a more sympathetic society. Um, it doesn't mean that people shouldn't try to get on in life and try to get through their day-to-day thing, but The point about depression is it really can cripple you in terms of functioning. This is the thing about depression. I mean, I've been through this, and believe me, you see, the thing is, if someone has a physical ailment, people don't judge them so much because you think, okay, well, that person is seriously physically ill, so they're bedbound. Um, they've got there's reason A, B, and C for not doing what they're doing. But because depression is largely invisible, like, you can't just see someone and know for certain that they're depressed. If then they procrastinate on things, then we have this thing in society, and I do want to mention this about work, about the whole notion of working hard, working hard. All the political parties use this as a sort of barometer of their values, and I find it rather tiresome. Just to be clear, it's not that I have anything against hard work, but I do have a problem with the notion that it's the only thing that matters. And Labour's been guilty of this for the past month. They've been using it as their tagline for every single thing. It's like they're trying to take it back from the Tories. But anyway, without making this video political, work is important, but what is the most important thing, actually, I believe, in any society is the contentment of people. Now, obviously, work brings about income, which then gives stability, which brings about contentment in many ways. So it is a factor, but I think the well-being of a society also depends on how happy people actually are. It's not how big a GDP is, although that is important. It's not everything. I mean, I saw a study a while back that stated the world's happiest country, and this is not an exact science, but that claimed that Bhutan, the small mountainous kingdom in the Himalayas, is the world's happiest country. Now, it's by no means a wealthy country. So that proves that material wealth and GDP size is not everything. And if you look at some wealthy countries like Japan, South Korea, I'm talking about countries with big GDPs, and a lot of the Scandinavian countries, the level of depression and suicide in those states is very high. So, that's something that we also need to consider. I mean, in my own personal life, I am not anywhere near as stable as I would like to be. And I know for a fact I would be happier if I was more stable. But I want to be more stable. I have no desire to be super rich. I really genuinely don't. Um, anyway, I'm covering a lot of themes in this video, and I'm just really throwing out ideas. What I want to ask people, this is an open question, if you've been patient enough to watch all of this. The open question is, how do you think people get about positive energy when it's so tempting to think that so many things are negative? I mean, I sometimes I feel envious of people who don't care about what's happening in the world and don't care about politics. Really can be totally detached. I feel envious of them because then they don't get depressed with some of the things I get depressed about. On the other hand, I choose to be informed about these things because I just prefer to be that way. I'm not going to sound snobbish and say I don't want to be ignorant, but really that's what it is. It is I would rather be informed about as much as possible. I just think it's a good way to be. Um, and I'm genuinely interested in what is happening. So anyway, that's the open question. How do people get about positive energy? Now, for me, there's little things that help me. Burning incense, for example, I find that therapeutic. Coffee and incense is a very good combination for me. Excuse me. Very occasionally I smoke, but not. It's not like a habit. So, and I'm going to be very careful not to get into that habit. But yeah, that also can be relaxing. It's like I have the occasional cigar or something. Um. Anyway, let me know your thoughts, and thanks for watching.